And we are recording.
Okay, John, do you want to call the meeting to order?
I was just going to say that. Let's call the City Council's Finance Committee of March 30th, 2021 to order.
Okay, this special meeting was called at the request of the council. We had an item related to funding of the Bay Street pedestrian path on our last council meeting agenda, and the council asked that the finance committee do a deeper dive into our ability to make these financial commitments. So as a result, Noah worked diligently on one of his fabulous PowerPoint presentations that he's going to share with you, and with your blessing, possibly that we would give this exact same presentation at our next city council meeting. So Noah, take it away.
Okay. I'm going to start by sharing my screen and trying to make it full screen so it's easier to read. So I sent this presentation out to the Finance Committee last week. Hopefully you had a chance to review it. What I'm hoping to do, I made this note here that, again, this is intended to provide estimates of potential funding sources as well as cost estimates. A lot of these numbers aren't finalized. We're just projecting out. This is very first slide. I just wanted to briefly revisit the history of this project from the financial perspective. And what you have at the top here is that from inception of this project going back to 1994 to early 2021, where we paid out a little bit of funds, we've spent a total of $4.064 million on this project. Of the $4 million, 1.6 million was for federal grants, 1.4 was for state grants, and roughly $893,000 was from local funding. Of the federal grants, of that $1.68 million, I want to turn your attention to this WAS.FHWA 6165 column for the $1.34 million. Okay, this comes up a few times as far as what would have to be refunded if we had to stop this project, or could we keep that money? And so I just wanted to point that column out. That's the one we usually typically talk about or think about, and that's the one you've heard the Public Works Director say he believes that under this historical context, phase one, we might not have to repay that money. But as we're in phase two of this project, some of the acquisitions right here under WAS.6165 for purchases may have to be refunded. And I believe he had a number of up to $800,000, if that's correct, Rob.
Sounds about right.
Okay. I put this slide in here, although it's a lot to absorb. I also attached it in your packet that's more blown up so you can actually read it. Again, this just provides the timeline of all the accomplishments of this project, what we've done and when. So now you have the timeline of the project successes as well as the spending plan from a historical perspective going all the way back to 1990.
Yeah, that's a great slide. Thank you for including that. I mean, many of us on the council were not around in 1990, so it's great to have the entire timeline of the project. It's great information.
And so what we really were talking about is, okay, that's the history. That's what we've already spent. That's what we've already accomplished. Now we're trying to move forward with this project and have the discussion, how do we move forward? So we have come up with a current project estimate of roughly $7.25 million going forward. That is includes $825,000 for right-of-way consulting services. We currently have a contract for approximately $200,000, and you've heard us talk about an additional $625,000 to move that project forward. So that's where we come up with the $825,000. Then we move on to the right-of-way purchase phase. We have a rough estimate of roughly $2 million. Again, and we won't have good numbers until we've completed the right-of-way consulting services phase. And then we move down to construction with, again, a rough number of $5 million. So the combination of the three pieces of that project bring us to $7.825 million of additional funding and expenses going forward. Down below here in this next table, we start to identify what funding sources have we already secured and do we have in place, and where do we have funding gaps. So currently we have a federal grant for right-of-way of $913,000. This would be cash provided to us. It is currently in the 21-22 budget. So this funding is available. We also have a real estate excise tax one, REIT one, that we're using $143,000, part of our matching component of this federal grant for the right-of-way phase. Again, this would be cash out of our REIT fund. It was budgeted, so this funding is available. We come to this third row here, and what I'm showing here is when we look at this $2.825 million right-of-way consulting services and purchase phase, this is the difference between what funding we have available and what we would need to complete that phase. So that's where we come with the $1.796 million of funding that we would need to complete that phase. I'm anticipating that we'd use some type of cash that we would be borrowing to pay for this phase. This is not budgeted, and I have funding is available, and we'll come to that topic here on the next couple slides. Then we move to the next portion of this project, which is the construction phase, the $5 million phase. In the $5 million construction phase, we have $2.9 million of a federal grant already awarded. So that would be cash to us. It's not in the budget because it's in a future biennial budget, 23-24, but the funding is available and committed towards the project. To complete the $5 million of funding, we would need an additional $2.1 million to complete the full funding of $5 million. So again, the funding source we're identifying or proposing is REIT 1 or 2 or a combination of. Again, this would be cash out of our account and not necessarily a borrowing. It's not budgeted yet because it relies on a future biennial budget cycle as well as future cash flows.
And Noah, it's important to note too, when we get to this construction phase, we should have a parks plan completed. We've included this project in our parks plan. So not only on the construction element, we likely can use REIT 1, REIT 2, and park impact fees. Now, how much it'll generate, we haven't done that body of work yet, but there's another bucket of dollars that we can likely get to help with this future phase.
Yes. So what this slide shows that of this $7 million project right now, we have a funding gap of roughly $3.896 million. And of those funds, we're proposing to use REIT 1, REIT 2, and potentially park impact fees, although I don't have that in this particular table. So I just want to pause there, make sure that that's clear. You guys are following that before I move on to the next portion of the discussion.
No, real quick. Oh, go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to point out that the additional REIT funding that we're going to need is out over the next biennial budget, or a portion of it at least.
It's at least 3, if not 5 years.
Right.
Our historical average is $700,000 a year. And we're performing much better, but like we can probably count on that performance in the short run, but you shouldn't plan long range on today's dollars. I think they're likely one-time revenues we're seeing right now, but
Right.
Our historic 5-year average is $700,000 a year.
And a portion of this unfunded REIT 1, REIT 2, we're anticipating that would be needed in the 21-22 biennial period.
Which part? No, which part?
The real estate acquisition.
The 1.8 million.
Yes.
Correct. Yes, because we're in the current right-of-way phase. We think we can complete the right-of-way phase prior to the end of 2022, which means we would need the $1.8 million in this biennium. So we'd have to commit that coming up. And then we would look at the next biennium to this $2.1 million funding gap.
And Noah, in your estimation, and I appreciate we're just a couple months into the 2021 year, but at the current rate that REIT is coming in, do you have any updated projections on what you would think would be in for the 21-22 biennium?
So perhaps before I answer that question, John, we'll move to the next slide, because I think
Okay.
that will kind of make clear what funding is available, and then we can talk about projections.
And then just one question on this slide, Noah.
Yeah.
Up above, we're aware of the change of the consulting services, right, which is reflected in the $825,000 number. Have we made any modifications based on what we know today, just kind of today's, I guess, state of the economy? Have any of these estimates been updated to numbers we may have seen previously with right-of-way purchase or construction, just for escalation or inflation?
Yeah, so I mean, these are the latest and greatest numbers that we have.
Okay, great.
Me and Mark sat down and said, okay, and the mayor, and said, hey, what do we really think this is going to cost as we kind of move over the next 4 years? So,
Perfect. I just want to make sure we weren't using numbers from 3 or 4 years ago, because obviously we're in a very different environment.
right.
Once again, they're estimate. We don't have
Understand.
appraisals. We don't have
Understand.
construction. Yeah, we got to bid.
Understand.
The other question I have is back with those consulting services, because that $825,000 number is our current contract and what we anticipate, and the proposed amendment to it. That particular contract indicates that there may be additional expenses, and we're not factoring those additional expenses in at all. That's a question, because I believe it said that there may be some additional certification work they need to do for DOT, and that would be an additional expense. And if we needed additional attorneys outside of what they've projected, that would be an additional expense. I'm wondering if that $825,000 number is a little light.
The 825 is not, it does not represent those factors, but the 1.8 million, almost 1.8 million, we're attempting to capture that. It's not just for it's for this whole phase.
It's for that. Okay, so that's for the whole phase. Okay.
Yeah, like the mayor said, we might, you're correct, Beck, we might be right here because we're really trying to earmark the dollars to make sense. And then we might have a little wiggle room in this $2 million that could cover that.
Okay.
And again, as the mayor said, these are all estimates. And
Yeah.
so we're gonna keep saying it throughout.
No, absolutely.
So I'll move on to the next slide. So this slide is intended to take a snapshot of where our real estate excise tax funds currently are. So I'm just going to kind of walk through, and I think it'll make sense. So starting from the top here, we have real estate excise tax 1 column, real estate excise tax 2 column. In this first REIT 1 column, we have a beginning balance as of January 1st, 2021 of $1.625 million. The next row here is actual revenues received through February 2021 of $148,000. The next row down is showing us what revenue we still have remaining to be collected in order to meet our biennial budget projection.
And that's at historical averages. That's assuming we get the 700,000 and not more.
That's the budgeted number.
Right.
Correct.
Yes,
Which
so,
for 2 months we're way outpacing.
Yes.
Right.
correct. And then the significance is that as I tie the numbers together, again, I'm tying it back to what we've adopted as a budget and as a plan.
Yep.
Because I always say, hey, we're only 2 months in, we're not sure, but this gives you some perspective of how much additional revenue we would need to collect in order to meet our total revenue budget figure for the biennium or REIT 1. So if we keep moving that down, then we have what we have budgeted for expenses. So if we just meet our budget, okay, everything comes in on budget, we would end 21-22 with $1.9 million in REIT 1 and $1.8 million in REIT 2. Okay. Now we've always talked about with the finance committee about how we have obligations for other projects when we're bringing in plans. They're not budgeted, so we obligate them under our impact fee spreadsheet as well as our REIT spreadsheet. So I've brought forward and identified those things in which we've obligated funding, but we have not taken forward and done a budget amendment yet for. So that's what this next row really represents. So when we look at the City Hall design at $250,000, this is an additional $250,000 that we'll plan to spend from REIT 1. So we're obligated it for that City Hall design. And I believe the Public Works Department is bringing that contract forward or has brought that forward. So this will be a real number. Yeah. Okay. So this will become a budgeted number. And that's important as I talk about the next particular number. So the next category as Tremont Audit Reserve. We've obligated $250,000. We're still trying to close out Tremont with WASDOT. Right now, we plan on everything going smooth and closing out just fine, that we did everything properly. And when that happens, we can remove this obligation and those funds will be available back in REIT 1. So now we move on to the Bay Street project. We've obligated, in this illustration, the 625, the additional right-of-way discussion piece, as well as the funding gap, 585 and 585, split between REIT 1 and REIT 2.
So now we've paid for the right-of-way phase that based on our estimates.
Yes. So the concept is that between these two obligations, we can cover that funding gap in the 21-22 period out of REIT 1 and REIT 2. And what does that look like? Well, then that leaves us with an ending fund balance in REIT 1 of $220,000 roughly by the end of 2022, and $1.2 million in REIT 2. So I just want to pause there, make sure that's sinking.
And that's assuming that we're going to spend that 250,000 for the audit reserve.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
At this point, it's just plus and minuses up, all the way up and down.
Yeah.
So then this last section here, this last row is for 23, 24, looking forward. Now, I don't have anything obligated out there other than I always continue to obligate debt service payments, because right now we pay for our Tremont debt service out of REIT 2. So I want to make sure that we continue to factor that into these discussions. So I have factored that $600,000 roughly payment coming out of REIT 2, which gets us to this kind of 23, 24 balance after these obligations of $220,000 and $630,000 by the end of 2024.
And that's based on our historic, and that's with the
Based on
additions of
budget.
700 a year in there, Noah? Are you making additions to that for revenue?
No, so what's important about this, and that's why I want to give everybody a chance to kind of make sure we're following this all the way down, is the only revenue assumptions I'm making are that we meet our current biennial budgeted revenues. That's it. I'm not adding anything more. I'm not escalating. I'm not factoring anything for 23, 24. So if we meet.
So that excise REIT 2, you anticipate getting what, $1.5 million each year, or $1.3 million?
Well, so great observation, Beck. Normally we would budget $700,000 for REIT 1 and REIT 2 in current revenue. And that's what we actually did in the budget. For REIT 2, we also have an additional $667,000 coming back to REIT 2 from the Tremont project. This was money that was appropriated and transferred over to the Tremont project in Fund 304, but was not needed and did not get spent. And so we were moving that money back to where it needs to go, because that's where the money came from.
So that's a one-time. So we would normally expect, looking at our bottom numbers, we could add 700,000 to each one of those, 1 and 2.
If you want to take this projection forward through 24, correct?
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And at some point, we'll be able to true up what's actualizing, in the year for the year. I mean, we're pacing well ahead of budget. I love what we've done. I love looking at budget. It's very conservative, but at some point we will be able to, take a look at what is actualized. I wouldn't want to extrapolate this out in too far into the future, but I think we can make adjustments, perhaps, at the end of each quarter or mid-year, just to, get a better idea of what these balances would look like. But again, I appreciate taking a conservative approach.
It's taking those, good observation there, Sean, and taking these conservative numbers based on balances, we'd have $850,000 of the 2.1 we need. And conservatively, you could add another 1.4 million to that. So while we're using virtually every dollar between now and the next biennium, we can afford to do this project, but we can't make any other commitments for our REIT dollars. It's very likely.
Yeah, and that's a really good segue, because again, I just want to walk this top to bottom, say where would we potentially end? And so I'll say $850,000 in our REIT funds. And then I want to move to the next slide, because the next question is, well, okay, if we commit all this money to it, we're still short if we only get the 850,000, right? We're still short of that 2.1, not factoring in new revenue. But what are all the other projects on the list? And the mayor is going to talk about this in the retreat coming up, but we put together the high level summary of current projects, funding gaps, just so everyone's aware of all the funding gaps we're trying to solve. So we do have the City Hall improvement project with an estimated cost of $8.5 million. We've funded $500,000 of that. Currently, we have $250,000 in the budget. We have $250,000, which we just talked about being obligated and needing to be a budget amendment for design. And so that leaves an $8 million at this point funding gap shortfall. So I'll come back to the bottom part, which is the funding solutions for this, and I'll let the mayor kind of weigh in on this, but I'm just going to walk through the table first. We are aware of the Bethel Lincoln Roundabout project, the TIB 2.04. Again, this is the new project, the $2.8 million. Of that, we think we currently have about an $800,000 funding shortfall. And again, that money would come from transportation impact fees. So over the next biennium, as long as we collect $800,000, that's where that money will be dedicated to. Then I have up here again the Bay Street Ped Path, the $7.82 million we talked about, the funding gap we just talked about, the $3.896 million. We have well 11, estimated project of $8 million with a current funding gap of $5.5 million. We have well 13 part B, because we are currently closing, currently closing part A down. So that's a fully funded project. That part's done. It's the part B that we're now looking to additional funding for, again, $5 million funding gap. And then lastly, I have on this particular list, Marina Pump Station, a $13 million project with a big funding gap. Again, we're trying to look for solutions there. I did put this whole other eligible capital projects category, because when you think about REIT funds, as long as it's in the comp plan and capital projects, it's an eligible use of those funds. And I didn't want to go through and put all the plans, because those are big lists, as you all are aware of and have seen. But we do have the transportation improvement plans. We do have all the water capital improvement plans, the sewer plans. We'll have new storm plans as they're completing that storm capital improvement plan. At some point, we'll have a completed, fully completed facility capital improvement plan, as well as a parks plan. So these are just other elements which would be eligible for the REIT funding. And I did not put those dollars amount in here at this time. I mainly focus on projects that we have going, that we're discussing, and have current funding shortfalls.
And so some of these funding solutions, I just want to hit at a high level. We know that we're likely going to get $3.2 million from the American Rescue Plan, and it'll come in 2 bites to us of about $1.5 million a piece in 2022 and 2023, and it needs to be spent on infrastructure. So we'll be able to reduce the funding gap on either any of those well projects or the Marina Pump Station project. And there'll be more dialogue about that as more details come about, and what all the rules and regulations related to that are. As we talked, we know that we have connection charges that are going to be able to pay for parts of the borrowings on those infrastructure projects, and rates are going to pay for elements of it. But the nice thing about the rescue plan money is it's going to reduce the amount of the borrowings that we're going to have. The transportation project, as long as development continues strong throughout the rest of this year, I don't see us having a problem raising the impact fees dollars to cover that Bethel project. What I do want to see us do, if we perform well enough, is I think things like this rescue plan and other forms of stimulus are going to be pretty commonplace in the next few years with the folks that we've got in Washington, D.C. And we need to have more. I wish I would have had something to offer besides the Anderson Hill Roundabout for a shovel-ready project. So it's going to be important to get Salmonberry or some other element of Bethel shovel-ready, so that we got something to pull off the shelf when those asks happen. I've envisioned the city hall borrowing as a borrowing since we've started this project process. And in the short, it just like Tremont though, an element of that service can be paid from REIT. Now we're going to be, we won't be able to do that in the next couple of bienniums, because if we fund this pathway project from there, we'll have little or no REIT dollars available for that. But in future years, if we get in a pinch in our general fund, that's a way we can make that debt service payment, because it's a capital project. So open for questions about our funding sources or how we're going to tackle some of these projects.
Maybe for the record, Noah, just remind the committee and for the record, just some of the policies relating to reserves that we try to maintain as it relates to any of these funds.
Yeah. So we have several different reserve policies, and as we discussed during the budget process, we fully meet. Well, but we've budgeted to fully meet our reserve policies by the end of this biennial period.
Yep.
And those policies are really focused on having available working capital, as well as setting 60 to 90 days of revenue aside in the event of a stated emergency under our reserve policies.
Exactly. So anything we're discussing here is beyond those budgeted reserves.
Yes. Yep.
Great. Thank you.
I think it would be important for the council to know if they chose not to move forward with the Bay Street pedestrian path out to Annapolis, what it would cost us to terminate that project.
Our best
Federal dollars that would need to be repaid.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that we'd have to remove the properties over the water that we've already purchased. And I know that there's a section of that roadway right at the foot of Tracy that needs repair. Basically a Jersey barrier or something there. So I was curious what those costs would be. I think it's important for us to have that evaluation.
And Mark and I discussed that, and Mark thinks we can tear those houses down for $100,000 a piece. I think that number's low, but let's assume he's right. That's the bottom line, because there's a chance, well, probably not. I think there's an exceptional chance that segment one, the part we built, that we'll get forgiveness in the federal dollars. I think it's not as likely that we would get forgiveness of the almost $600,000 that we used to buy the two houses that we own.
Correct.
And then on top of that, we have the demolition costs. So I think you have a floor if you took Mark's number and we got complete forgiveness of a couple $100,000, but I believe that the liability is closer to $1 million.
Well, I would add that, although I appreciate Mark's optimism, tearing down a structure over water, if you could do that for 100,000, I would be amazed. The environmental aspects of taking that out.
Yeah.
It's not just bring in an excavator and tear it down and throw it into a dumpster.
Yes. And the other poison pill to this, to a certain extent, is because we're building a capital project, we have access to our REIT dollars. If we don't move forward with this as a capital project and we pull the plug on it, we have to pay that with our general fund dollars, which is how we pay for people, parks, and our street maintenance. Those are the big tickets that we would need to look, and our reserves, obviously.
Well, and I would add to that, if we were to go down that path and repay the funds, that will really, in my opinion, jeopardize our ability to access future funds. This pretty much sets a track record that is not a good thing to have. I think we can look to our friends up on Bainbridge Island as an example of a project they started down the path with and returned the funds, and they're still dealing with that issue.
But it hasn't stopped them from getting other transportation dollars out of KRCC.
but they haven't been able to get much out of Seattle area.
Well, no one does.
Well, they did because they got tied up with DOT to get some of those funds.
Right, right. The project that they gave back, what I'm saying, John, is I agree with what you're saying, except the portion that I haven't seen it actually affect Bainbridge Island negatively yet. Because they haven't asked for another regional ask, and their countywide asks were basically for improvements for multimodal paths. So I don't know that they've really had a big ask yet. So it kind of remains to be seen how much that's going to impact them.
That's what I was going to say. It's yet to be determined, the impact,
Yeah,
but it
right.
certainly is still being discussed frequently. I know that.
Yeah.
Well, I know many of us were not happy about their actions.
Right.
But what I'm hearing, because I too agree that $100,000 to remove those homes is, it seems very light to me. I also think your $1 million number may be light. Rob, I would expect we would have to pay back at least the money. Yeah, I think $1 million, I think that would be the bottom end to come out of that, for us to come out of the project.
Yeah, it's their guesses until we get it and,
Right, no,
and
exactly.
ask the question. And you don't ask the question until you file the paperwork.
Right.
pull the
And
plug on
the
it.
one thing that I'm not sure you're aware of, but that one section of road from the property we own, that's got the fence in front of it,
Mhm.
from there to what used to be Josephine's, that section of road, there's a guardrail on it, but it's in real poor shape. And I'm not sure if that's where the culvert where Arnold Creek comes out or not, but that would naturally be taken, repaired in the construction of the path.
Mhm.
But if we don't do the path, if we were to terminate that, that section of road still needs some significant repairs. So I think we would need to add that to a termination cost. I realize the bucket of money would be different, but I think it's something that we would have to address.
Yeah, with local dollars. And then
Correct.
there's we're walking away from nearly $3 million in federal money that puts,
Right.
jobs and work in our community.
The other question, and no, I think you did a reasonable job. Go forward a few more slides where you showed the projects that are the major projects that are still outstanding. Okay. You've got City Hall and the Lincoln Roundabout and all of those. But what we're not looking at there are future capital projects that we're not seeing. And at our transportation committee meeting last week, we were talking about Sydney, south of Tremont, north of Highway 16, where we need some improvements. But those are all contingent on stormwater. And we heard at transportation last week that nothing can happen up there until we purchase property for the stormwater. And we apparently had asked for a grant last year in the neighborhood of $1 million, and that was rejected. So I guess what I'm trying to say is when we come to the stormwater update that we're looking at, there may be capital projects in there that we're unaware of right now that are going to warrant funding on our part. So the other thing I think council needs to look at are what are we not going to be able to do or have to delay because of expending all the REIT dollars for the path.
So Beck, there's a great question there. And it's part of one of the topics on the retreat,
Right.
And where we're at on that piece of property is you're right, where there's $1 million piece of property we need to buy. That's the start. And then potentially there's some phasing we could do. It's a major multi-year project to get out there. We intend to apply for that grant again this year. If we're unsuccessful, I think we're going to need to either do a borrowing to buy that piece of property, because otherwise houses are going to get built on it and our opportunity will be lost. We have a willing seller to sell that piece of property. We also have, and we'll talk about this at retreat, we planned on having a cash carry forward at the beginning of the year of about $3 million. We haven't even discussed we came in $3 million north of that. So we've got about $3 million that we can talk about at the retreat. And I think we have some more street needs from street paving and preservation and maintenance, because the sinkhole is going to take a big bite out of what we plan to do. And I think we need to fill that bucket back up. And I think we should plan for, I just hate to borrow too much money. And I think if we don't get the grant, I think we need to spend some of our money and go buy that piece of property as we do an in-house design for some of those stormwater improvements. So, but those are things I plan to bring up at the retreat.
The other thing that I just need to say it out loud is I know that this contract for the right-of-way agent is time sensitive, because it's going to take time to do all the work necessary to acquire those properties. But a lot of the things that may help us make our educated decision, we're going to discuss at the retreat on August 23rd. So I just wish that time-wise we were a little closer, synchronized with that. But we're not.
Yeah, I think the exercise here tonight, and I hope you agree that we should share this entire presentation with the full council next week, is that, yes, we're going to leverage virtually all of our REIT dollars for this biennium and next biennium, but we can afford to do this. We're not doing something else that we have in our plan. But you're right, Beck. We need. There's but some of these other elements like Sydney South and Bethel, we do have transportation impact fees that are coming in, and they're coming in strong. So we'll be able to spend some of those dollars that way for designs and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and it's
First
always
off,
nice
I would definitely say this needs to go to the full council, obviously. Sorry, Sean, go ahead.
No, yeah, absolutely. And, as we continue discussions at council meetings or our retreats too about, finite amount of REIT dollars, or any dollars for that matter, is to understand the propensity for these to have a greater return on investment than others, right? I mean, we're going to see what happens with the entire feasibility of this community center, but, having access to these other pot of dollars that would trigger, a reinvestment in our downtown community, bring in, new jobs, new retail establishments, new housing establishments. I mean, this is kind of how you invest and start to see a return on that in future years, and the replenishment of those versus other projects that may not have that same opportunity for a return. So I do like the fact that some of these dollars, if invested appropriately, could lead to additional development, which obviously leads to additional dollars in these buckets.
I would add, in my personal opinion, this pathway is an investment in the entire community, not just the downtown. So there are so many people that are taking advantage of the short section that we have completed so far that it's shocking, in my opinion.
Yes. And on a positive note, and John and I have been comparing scorecards earlier today on, we don't have the full sales tax report. I do have January's sales tax, which is our March sales, the money we got in March for January. And it was 23% over year for $91,000. And $118,000 over budget for that 1 month, or 32%. And for the quarter, we are $343,000 ahead of budget in sales tax. But we have to remember, this is an anomaly. I believe an anomaly, and this is one-time revenue. These additional
One-time dollars.
they're not things we should be spending on ongoing operations.
Well, they're not all one-time dollars. Some of them are. There are some anomalies, but we are experiencing growth in our community, and so some of these dollars will absolutely be recurring.
Yeah, but I don't think we're going to see this kind of a growth as we go forward. I mean, it's unprecedented. The increase in the cost of lumber is just one example. And couple that with the building that's going on in our community, that's not going to continue. I mean, that in itself is huge. Now, granted, we're benefiting from a good, strong economy right now, even with COVID.
We
Yeah.
And
just
the
have to be
projection
cautious.
that I've been reading is continuing through this year. I mean, the Puget Sound economists, they're talking 15% growth this year in Kitsap County alone.
Yeah. But if we fill, when you look at the amount of homes that have been built and occupied over the last 24 months, and the other projects coming on board, these are new residents to our cities. Our population will grow, and so again, some of this growth will be recurring. Not all of it, but some of it will, just by the effects of growth.
And more people here spending dollars. Yeah.
That's what I mean. More people living here now.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing that you haven't touched on is the change in buying habits of the population.
That's right.
They may not be running to Silverdale or Tacoma or whatever, and they may be using Amazon a lot more, or should I say home delivery purchases more. And all of that's reflected in the sales tax numbers we're looking at. But what's that going to look like moving forward? We don't know.
Yep. It's awesome. We need to spend those dollars cautiously is all.
No, I'm
Yep.
fully supportive of that, Rob. You never know when folks are going to go back to the mall and not buy online.
Or go to Jamaica,
You're
because
right,
they can't go on vacation right now.
right.
Or it's
Right.
more difficult.
I was planning on going to Gorse as far as I could see.
Okay, anything else?
All right.
Yes,
Anything more?
before we leave this, since you want this to come back to full council, is there anything that wasn't clear on the slides? Anything you want me to go back to?
I personally think it was excellent, Genoa. So I don't know if others have any comments.
No, I agree.
Beck
Thank you.
only gave you a fair.
I
She
know.
said that you did a fair job. John said you did an excellent job. So Sean, what's your vote?
What's politically correct? I think he's done a really good job.
No, what I would do, because I really appreciate all the information you gave us, but I do think it's important that the council see what it would cost to terminate the project. And if you just have just a slide on those particular estimates, I think that needs to be, I think council needs to see that.
Okay, but once again, it's their estimates.
Oh,
Yep.
everything we're looking at is an estimate.
Yeah.
I would try to reach out if you can and see if you can refine those estimates on taking those houses down, because I truly believe that 100,000 is way light.
Okay. I think we should double that, a couple 100,000 a piece myself. And Mark thinks we're gonna slide them onto a barge and they're gonna disappear. And I'm going, yeah.
Yeah, remind him before they could get onto a barge, you have to pull all those pilings out. You just can't go down and saw them off. So
Yeah, I'm with you, John. So.
All right.
Beck, right? I mean, $1 million could be on the low side. I mean, I think we got to give a range.
Right, we have to give a range. And I also think if we had just some estimate of what it's going to cost us to fix that one section of roadway, which obviously would be included when we do the path and would be transportation dollars anyway, but it's still a cost that the city would not be expecting out of their general fund right now.
So what I'm hearing is you want to cost, I'm thinking 400 for the houses, and we saw 600 for the repayment of the federal dollars. And then if we, get an estimate for that section of roadway to repair that section of roadway, here's what it's going to cost us in local dollars to not move forward on this, because we're going to need to make necessary road improvements, repay federal money, and remove homes.
Well, and I think there's another point that you mentioned earlier, Rob, that's really important, is where the money comes from to do this. It's coming out of general fund, not out of REIT.
Mm-hmm.
Because that impacts a lot of the operation of the city, not just capital.
Fair points. Did you capture those ideas, Noah?
I'm recording.
Okay.
Good
Okay.
point.
Okay, we'll talk about this tomorrow. And
All
what
right,
we'll
very
make
good.
another slide, and then maybe Noah can get from fair to good.
To good.
Well, I gave Noah excellent just because of his PowerPoint. I mean, that's class act. So is there anything else that we need to discuss on this meeting?
No, I think
so.
I think our goal was to get the information for the rest of the council and for us to understand it. And Noah, you did do a stellar job of providing the information in a format that was easily understood.
Good. Okay. That's always my
Good
goal.
job.
Yeah.
So before we raise Noah up to the platinum level, we should probably adjourn this meeting soon. So otherwise his head will get too big.
Yeah.
Again,
So-
you're recording so I can watch this back and forth many times.
All right, unless there's something for the good of the order, then I'm going to declare this committee meeting adjourned. And thank
Thanks,
you all.
everyone. Thank you.